The greatest armada in galactic history didn't lose because of superior enemy tactics. They lost because a glowing rock got cracked. The fleet admiral had already signed the surrender broadcast. The evacuation klaxons were screaming. And down in the bowels of the flagship, a guy making minimum wage with a bad back looked at the failing warp core, pulled out a roll of silver tape, and muttered, "I ain't dying over a leaky pipe." The tactical display hanging over the bridge of the Aegis was bleeding. Admiral Briggs stood rigidly before the holographic projection, his hands clasped behind his back, so tightly his knuckles were white. The red icons of the enemy dreadnoughts were swarming the outer perimeter of the fleet, systematically dismantling the coalition's defensive lines. Sirens wailed a dissonant, overlapping chorus of doom that vibrated through the deck plates and deep into the bones of every officer in the room. "Shields in Sector 4 are gone," Lieutenant Jenkins announced. His voice was flat stripped of all panic by the sheer weight of inevitability. "Hull breaches reported on decks 12 through 40. They're targeting our power grid." Briggs didn't blink. He watched the projection as another blue icon, a cruiser carrying 3,000 souls, winked out of existence. The silence on the bridge felt heavier than the explosions rocking the hull. "Status of the main core," Briggs asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Chief Engineer Wallace, staring frantically at a secondary monitor, swallowed hard. "Containment is failing, sir. The crystalline matrix took a micro-fracture during that last kinetic strike. The primary plasma conduit is leaking. If we push the engines to escape velocity, the core will rupture, will vaporize. Time to catastrophic failure. 10 minutes, maybe less. Sir, we have no power for weapons. We have no engines. We are dead in the water." Wallace looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat. "If we don't dump the core, it takes us all." Briggs closed his eyes. 30 years of military service, hundreds of battles, and it ended here. Not in a blaze of glory, but stalled out in the dark, waiting for the executioner's axe. "Prepare the surrender broadcast," Briggs said. The words tasted like ash. "Order all personnel to abandon the lower decks. Seal the core room. Let's at least try to save the crew." 80 decks below, Arthur Pendleton leaned heavily against the handle of his mop. He was 52 years old, had bad knees, and possessed a lower back that reliably predicted the atmospheric pressure changes of whatever planet they were orbiting. His graying hair was stuffed beneath a grease-stained cap, and his faded blue jumpsuit bore the emblem of Coalition sanitation, the absolute bottom rung of the galactic ladder. Humans didn't get to fly the ships. They didn't get to shoot the guns. When Earth was folded into the Coalition, the alien brass looked at humanity's crude combustion engines and chaotic history and decided they were best suited for manual labor. They were the galaxy's janitors, mechanics, and cargo haulers. Arthur didn't mind. He preferred the quiet. Right now, however, the quiet was ruined. The emergency strobes were flashing a blinding rhythmic crimson, and a synthetic voice was repeating the evacuation order on a loop. "Warning, core breach imminent. Abandon lower decks." "This is not a drill," Arthur sighed. He looked down at the puddle of glowing blue hypercoolant he had just spent 20 minutes corralling into a neat pile with his squeegee. It was sticky, it smelled sharply of ammonia, and it stained the deck plating if you didn't scrub it right away. Down the corridor, a pack of junior engineering techs sprinted past. They didn't even look at him. They were terrified, dropping tools and data pads in their haste to reach the escape pods. "Hey!" Arthur barked, his gravelly voice cutting through the wail of the sirens. "Watch the wet floor, you idiots. I just mopped that. One of the techs, a young kid named Carter, paused just long enough to shout back. "Run, old man! The core is going critical! We're dead!" Carter scrambled away, leaving Arthur standing alone in the strobing red light. Arthur looked at the abandoned tools. He looked at his mop bucket. He looked down the long, arching hallway that led to the primary core chamber. The heavy blast doors were slowly groaning shut, designed to seal the blast when the singularity went critical. He dug a calloused hand into his pocket, pulling out a battered tin of chewing tobacco. He packed a small pinch into his lower lip, spitting a brown stream into his waste bucket. He had heard the broadcast. Surrender. They were giving up the ship. "I've got 3 months left till retirement," Arthur muttered to himself. "I am not spending it in a POW camp because these college kids don't know how to turn a wrench." He grabbed the handle of his janitorial cart. The front left wheel squeaked terribly, a high-pitched metallic chirp that drove the officers crazy, but Arthur found comforting. He leaned his weight into it and started walking toward the core room, the squeak of the wheel keeping time with the apocalypse. He squeezed through the heavy blast doors just before they slammed shut, sealing him inside. The primary core chamber of the Aegis was designed to look like a temple. The alien architects who built the flagship believed that handling the raw fabric of the universe required reverence. The room was massive, vaulted like a cathedral, with floating walkways suspended over a dizzying drop into the ship's lower engineering bays. In the center of the room hung the Singularity Drive. It was a swirling, furious sphere of trapped starlight, caged within a complex geometric web of crystalline conduits and magnetic inhibitors. Usually it glowed a calm, steady sapphire. Today it was pulsing an angry, bruised purple. The air in the room was thick. It tasted like metal and ozone. The static charge was so high that the hair on Arthur's arms stood straight up, and the fillings in his teeth vibrated uncomfortably. Arthur pushed his cart down the main catwalk. Squeak, squeak, squeak. He didn't look at the holographic displays flashing with esoteric alien math. He couldn't read them anyway. He didn't look at the warning runes spinning rapidly in the air. He listened. Before he was drafted into the Coalition fleet, Arthur had worked in a diesel garage in Detroit. He had spent 30 years listening to the rhythmic thump of heavy engine blocks, the sharp hiss of air brakes, and the high-pitched whine of failing alternators. He had developed an ear that could diagnose a dying transmission from 3 bays away. Machines were machines. Whether it burned diesel or compressed space-time, an engine was just a box that made heat and pressure to do work. And when they broke, they all cried the same way. Arthur stopped his cart halfway down the bridge. He cocked his head, closing his eyes to shut out the blinding purple flashes from the Singularity. Underneath the roaring bass of the failing magnetic field, he heard it. Shh, pop. Shh, pop. It was a sharp rhythmic hiss, followed by a slight stutter in the engine's vibration. It was exactly the sound a cracked manifold made when a gasket blew out. He opened his eyes and followed the sound. He walked up to the primary plasma feed, a massive transparent tube, thicker than an oak tree, that fed coolant directly into the Singularity's housing. The engineers had abandoned the station. Their tablets were left flashing red on the control console. Arthur stepped around the console and peered at the base of the tube, where it connected to the heavily armored deck plating. There it was, a hairline fracture in the crystalline housing, no wider than a piece of thread winding its way up the side of the conduit. Through the crack, a jet of superheated invisible plasma was venting into the room. It was acting like a pressure release valve, bleeding off the containment pressure. "Well, there's your problem," Arthur grunted. He reached out, waving his hand, about 2 feet away from the pipe. The heat coming off the vent was intense, singeing the hairs on his knuckles. The pressure inside that tube had to be astronomical. He looked at the engineer's abandoned data pad. It showed a schematic of the ship with a red bar rapidly dropping towards zero. Containment pressure. When that bar hit the bottom, the singularity would expand, consuming the ship and everything within 1,000 miles. Arthur looked around the pristine, high-tech room. There were no toolboxes. There were no spare parts. The Coalition engineered everything to be modular. If something broke, you swapped the whole unit. You didn't patch it, but you couldn't swap a core while it was running, and you couldn't shut it down while under fire. The ship shuddered violently. Another hit from the enemy fleet. Dust and small pieces of debris rained down from the vaulted ceiling. The purple light of the core flickered, growing noticeably brighter. The red bar on the datapad dropped another inch. Arthur spat into his empty coffee cup. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Amateurs," he said softly. He walked back to his janitorial cart. He opened the bottom compartment, pushing aside bottles of industrial floor wax and heavy-duty degreaser. He reached into the very back, feeling around in the dark, until his fingers brushed against cold, heavy plastic. He pulled out an old, scuffed metal toolbox. He had smuggled it aboard 5 years ago. He flipped the latches. Inside wasn't a collection of laser welders or zero-point spanners. It was a chaotic mess of human ingenuity. Vice grips, crescent wrenches, zip ties, WD-40, and sitting right on top, a thick, heavy roll of silver tape. This wasn't standard issue. This was military-grade, heavily reinforced duct tape, the kind with the thick woven mesh inside. Back on Earth, guys used it to patch helicopter rotors in the field. It was rated for extreme heat, extreme cold, and extreme stupidity. Arthur grabbed the roll. He grabbed a heavy leather welding glove. He slammed the toolbox shut. The deck plates were vibrating so hard now he could barely stand. The whine of the failing core was deafening, a physical pressure pushing against his eardrums. He walked back to the cracked plasma conduit. The hiss was louder now, a furious scream of escaping energy. "All right, you son of a bitch," Arthur said, pulling the welding glove onto his left hand. "Let's see what you got." On the bridge, Admiral Briggs watched the main view screen. The enemy dreadnought, a massive jagged wedge of black metal, had pulled alongside the Aegis. Its weapons batteries were glowing, charging for the final killing blow. "They are hailing us, sir," Jenkins said, his voice trembling slightly. "Put them through," Briggs ordered, straightening his tunic. If he was going to surrender, he would do it with his spine straight. The view screen flickered, replacing the image of the enemy ship with the sneering face of an Armada commander. "Coalition flagship," the enemy commander drawled. "Your power grid is collapsing. Your shields are down. You are beaten. Transmit your surrender codes, and we will allow you to evacuate your crew before we scuttle your vessel." Briggs took a deep breath. "This is Admiral..." Suddenly the lights on the bridge flickered. Not the dying, sputtering flicker of a failing generator, but a sharp, aggressive surge of power. The red emergency strobe snapped off. The overhead lighting slammed back on, blindingly white and fully functional. "Jenkins!" Briggs snapped, whipping his head around. "Report!" Jenkins was staring at his console, his hands flying over the holographic keys. "Sir, power is surging. It's coming from the primary core. The pressure, it's stabilizing." "That's impossible!" Wallace yelled from his station, scrambling back to his monitors. "The conduit is breached. The containment pressure should be dropping." "It's not," Jenkins said, his voice rising in disbelief. "Pressure is at 40%, 50. Sir, containment is reestablishing." The core is green. I repeat, the core is green. Down in the core room, Arthur was engaged in a brutal physical wrestling match with a machine that defied the laws of physics. The heat was agonizing. Even through the thick leather of the welding glove, his left hand felt like it was resting on a hot stove. He had wrapped his left arm tightly around the crystalline conduit, pressing the palm of his gloved hand directly over the crack to stem the flow of the venting plasma. The pressure pushing against his hand was immense. It felt like trying to hold back a fire hose with his thumb. His boots slipped on the slick deck plates as he braced his shoulder against the pipe, grinding his teeth together as sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. "Come on," he grunted, the muscles in his back screaming in protest. With his right hand, he held the roll of tape. He needed to get the first wrap around the pipe, but he had to do it blind, threading the tape behind the conduit and pulling it tight over his own hand. He bit down on his lip, tasting blood. He slid his left hand up a fraction of an inch, letting a jet of scorching air hiss past his wrist, and jammed the end of the tape against the glass. He brought the roll around the back of the pipe, catching it with his left thumb, and pulled violently. Rip! The sound of the adhesive unspooling was loud, a harsh tearing noise that cut through the whine of the engine. He pulled it tight, wrapping it diagonally across the fracture. The tape immediately began to smoke the silver backing, turning brown from the intense heat of the pipe, but the heavy-duty adhesive held. Arthur didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He kept pulling, wrapping the tape around and around the conduit in a tight overlapping spiral. He used his body weight to stretch the tape, binding the crack with layers of thick, reinforced mesh. He moved with a frantic, practiced rhythm, his hands flashing as he wound the tape higher and higher up the pipe. 10 layers. 20 layers. The smell of burning adhesive and melting rubber filled the room, acrid and foul, choking him. He coughed, spitting tobacco juice onto the deck, and kept rapping. He rapped until the roll was entirely gone, leaving a thick, ugly, smoking gray bulge around the pristine, crystalline conduit. Arthur stumbled back, dropping the empty cardboard core of the tape roll. He fell onto his backside, his chest heaving, his left hand trembling violently inside the scorched welding glove. He stared at the pipe. The tape was blackening at the edges. It was bubbling slightly in the center where the crack was widest. But the hiss was gone. The leak had stopped. Above him, the core shifted. The angry, bruised purple light flared one last time before settling instantly into a cool, steady, brilliant sapphire blue. The violent shaking of the deck plates smoothed out into a deep, comforting purr. Arthur let out a long, ragged breath. He pulled off his cap and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Nothing a little tape can't fix," he rasped, coughing into his fist. On the bridge, absolute chaos had erupted. "Shields are at 100%, Jenkins shouted, practically leaping out of his chair. "Primary weapons batteries are fully charged. Main thrusters are online." Admiral Briggs stared at the tactical display. The Aegis was no longer a dead icon. It was glowing bright green, a fully armed dreadnought sitting right in the middle of the enemy formation. The Armada commander on the view screen looked utterly confused. "What trick is this your core was failing?" Briggs didn't answer him. The shock had passed, replaced by the cold, calculating instinct of a veteran predator who suddenly found himself holding a loaded gun. "Cut the transmission," Briggs ordered coldly. The view screen went black. He turned to his weapons officer. "Target the enemy dreadnought. Fire all forward batteries." Jenkins signaled the fleet. The Aegis is back in the fight. Break their lines. The flagship shuddered, not from enemy fire, but from the massive recoil of its own primary cannons. Two lances of blinding white energy tore through the void, striking the unshielded enemy dreadnought at point-blank range. The black wedge of metal was ripped in half, exploding into a silent, expanding cloud of debris. Cheers erupted across the bridge, a deafening wave of relief and adrenaline. Briggs stood tall, watching the tactical display as his revitalized ship tore into the enemy formation. The tide had turned in an instant. He turned to Chief Engineer Wallace, who was staring at his console as if it were a ghost. "Wallace," Briggs demanded over the noise of the bridge. "What the hell just happened? How did you fix the core?" Wallace looked up, his eyes wide, completely bewildered. "Sir," Wallace stammered, pointing a shaky finger at the telemetry data. "I didn't do anything. The system, it says the primary conduit breach was physically sealed from the outside." Briggs frowned. "By who the engineering team evacuated?" Wallace tapped the screen, pulling up the internal security feed for the core room. The image flickered onto the secondary display. It showed the massive, pristine cathedral of the engine room. It showed the glowing sapphire core, and it showed Arthur Pendleton. The janitor was sitting on the deck, leaning back against his squeaky yellow cart. He was slowly, painfully peeling a smoking leather glove off his hand. Around the base of the multi-billion credit hyperdimensional plasma feed was a thick, ugly mass of gray duct tape. Briggs stared at the screen. The entire bridge crew, noticing the feed, slowly fell silent. Arthur didn't look at the security camera. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his tin, and packed another pinch of tobacco. He picked up his mop, leaned heavily on the handle, and slowly pushed himself to his feet. He looked at the puddle of spilled hypercoolant near his cart. He sighed, shaking his head, and started to mop. The battle lasted another 42 minutes, but the outcome had been decided the second the Aegis fired its main batteries. The coalition fleet, rallied by their flagship rising from the grave, tore the enemy armada to shreds. The dreadnoughts that didn't burn retreated into the dark, their warp trails scattered and desperate. When the final, all-clear klaxon sounded, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the ship. It was the silence of thousands of men and women realizing they were still breathing. Down in the primary core chamber, the silence was broken by the frantic tapping of holographic keyboards. Chief Engineer Wallace stood a safe 20 feet back from the plasma conduit. He was surrounded by a team of senior technicians, men and women, with multiple advanced degrees in theoretical physics and quantum mechanics. They were holding scanning wands and data tablets, moving around the base of the crystalline tube, with the cautious reverence of bomb disposal experts. Admiral Briggs walked into the chamber. His uniform was rumpled, the sharp lines of his tunic ruined by the sweat and stress of the last hour. He bypassed the security cordon and marched straight toward Wallace. "Talk to me, Chief," Briggs said, his voice raspy. Wallace jumped slightly, pulling his eyes away from a data pad. "Admiral, the core is stable. Output is resting at a steady 85%. We have enough power to maintain life support shields and sublight engines. But, sir, we are looking at the patch now." Briggs looked past Wallace. The base of the multi-billion credit dimensional plasma conduit looked diseased. The thick bundle of gray tape had melted and fused together into a hard, blackened lump. The edges were charred, and a thick smear of brown adhesive had baked onto the pristine crystalline glass. It was ugly. It was an insult to the clean geometric lines of the alien architecture. "Have you identified the material?" Briggs asked. "We ran a full spectroscopic analysis. a senior technician named Miller said, stepping forward. He looked deeply disturbed. It's a primitive polymer compound, mostly polyethylene, and a fabric mesh, likely cotton, or a synthetic equivalent coated in a rubber-based adhesive. Briggs frowned. Rubber and cloth, Miller, the internal temperature of that plasma feed is roughly equivalent to the surface of a main sequence star. The ambient heat on the glass alone should have flash incinerated any carbon-based material instantly. It should have, sir, Miller agreed, shaking his head. But it didn't. The overlapping layers created a crude thermal sink. The outer layers burned, yes, but they insulated the inner layers just long enough for the adhesive to melt into the microfracture and vulcanize. The sheer kinetic pressure of the venting plasma essentially baked the rubber into a solid plug. The tensile strength of the fabric mesh is holding the plug in place. Wallace rubbed his temples. It's a structural nightmare, Admiral. It completely violates every safety protocol in the Coalition manual. If the pressure fluctuates by even a fraction of a percent, that patch will blow, and we'll lose the ship. But it's holding right now, Briggs pointed out. Yes, Wallace admitted, clearly pained by the word. It's holding. Then leave it alone, Briggs ordered. Do not touch it. Do not look at it too hard. Just get us back to the nearest shipyard. Briggs turned away from the smoking gray lump and looked around the vast, vaulted room. The janitorial cart was gone. The puddle of hypercoolant had been cleanly mopped up. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all, save for the wet floor sign neatly positioned near the entryway. "Where is he?" Briggs asked. "Who, sir?" Wallace asked. "The man who saved my ship." Arthur Pendleton was sitting in a metal folding chair in the ship's holding area, drinking the worst cup of coffee in the galaxy. His knees ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. His left hand, still resting in his lap, was wrapped in a thick layer of medical gauze. The ship's automated med bay had treated the second-degree burns on his palm, injecting him with a cocktail of synthetic painkillers that made his teeth feel fuzzy. He took a sip of the lukewarm synthetic coffee substitute and grimaced. He missed real coffee. He missed gravity that didn't hum. He missed his toolbox. Security had confiscated it. The heavy doors to the holding area slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Admiral Briggs walked in, followed closely by Chief Engineer Wallace. Arthur didn't stand up. He just looked at them over the rim of his paper cup. "Mr. Pendleton," Briggs said, stopping a few feet away. His tone was impossible to read, caught somewhere between profound gratitude and utter bewilderment. "Admiral," Arthur replied. His voice was sandpaper rough. Briggs looked at Arthur's bandaged hand. "The medical staff informs me you suffered severe thermal damage to your left extremity." "Grabbed a hot pipe," Arthur said simply. "Happens." Wallace stepped forward, holding Arthur's battered metal toolbox. He set it down on the table between them, as if it contained a live explosive. He popped the latches and opened the lid. The crescent wrenches, the zip ties, the can of WD-40 sat there in chaotic defiance of Coalition engineering standards. "Mr. Pendleton," Wallace started, his voice tight. "We have spent the last hour trying to understand how you bypass the magnetic containment field safeties without triggering a cascade failure. The logs show no electronic interface. You didn't slice the mainframe. You didn't reroute the coolant flow." "I don't know how to do any of that," Arthur said. He set his coffee cup down. "I just pushed the door open before it locked." Wallace looked exasperated. "You entered a high radiation zone during a critical containment failure. You approached a compromised plasma conduit that was venting superheated energy. And you You applied an unrated, unauthorized chemical binding agent to the fracture. I used duct tape, Arthur corrected. Duct tape, Wallace repeated, testing the words on his tongue. The technical readouts on this material are baffling. What is its maximum thermal rating? What quantum stress limits is it designed for? Arthur let out a dry, raspy chuckle. He leaned forward, resting his good elbow on the table. Chief, you're overthinking it, Arthur said. It's tape. You buy it at a hardware store for $6 a roll. We use it to patch drywall. We use it to hold car bumpers on after a fender bender. Hell, my buddy Jimmy used it to tape his boot together when the sole fell off. It doesn't have a quantum stress limit. Briggs frowned, stepping closer. Then how did you know it would hold back a dimensional plasma breach? I didn't, Arthur said honestly. But I knew what the pipe sounded like. It sounded like a cracked exhaust manifold. You got pressure inside, you got a hole, the pressure leaks out. If you stop the hole, you stop the leak. It is not a pipe, Wallace protested, his voice rising in volume. It is a crystalline matrix designed to channel raw, unfiltered starlight into a localized gravity well. The internal pressure is, it's a pipe. Arthur interrupted, his voice suddenly hard. He looked Wallace dead in the eye. It carries hot stuff from point A to point B. It cracked. I plugged it. You guys were too busy looking at your little glowing screens and running your math to realize that the simplest way to stop a leak is to put your hand over it. Silence stretched across the room. Wallace opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer absurdity of the situation robbed him of the words. A guy with a mop had just schooled the coalition's brightest mechanical mind on the fundamentals of plumbing. Briggs let out a slow breath. A faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. You used an unauthorized tool to perform an unsanctioned repair on a critical ship system, Briggs said, slipping back into his authoritative command voice. By all rights, Mr. Pendleton, I should have you thrown in the brig for reckless endangerment of a military vessel. Arthur shrugged. I was getting blown up anyway. Figured I'd take the write-up. However, Briggs continued, ignoring the comment. You also saved this ship. You saved my crew. The coalition owes you a debt it can never repay. When we reach the shipyard at Core Station, I am personally recommending you for the highest civilian commendation the fleet offers. I don't want a medal, Arthur said. I want my pension. I've got 3 months left. And I want my toolbox back. That's a good set of vice grips. Briggs nodded slowly. You'll have your pension and your tools. Suddenly, the deck beneath their feet lurched. It wasn't the violent tearing shudder of an enemy kinetic strike. It was a deep, rhythmic grinding vibration that resonated through the metal walls. The lights in the holding room flickered, dimming to a dull yellow, before surging back to blinding white. Overhead, the ship's intercom crackled to life. It was Lieutenant Jenkins, and his voice was bordering on panic. Admiral Briggs to the bridge. Chief Wallace to engineering, sir. We have a massive pressure spike in the primary core. Wallace went pale. He looked down at the toolbox, then back at Arthur. Arthur sighed. He reached over, picked up his coffee cup, and drained the last cold, bitter drop. He slowly stood up, his bad knees popping loudly in the quiet room. Told you, Arthur muttered. It's only tape. It wasn't meant to hold forever. The bridge was pandemonium when Briggs arrived. The tactical displays were flashing yellow, throwing harsh, jaundiced light across the faces of the crew. The deep, grinding vibration was louder up here, a physical assault that rattled teeth and made screens blur. Report, Briggs barked, striding to the center console. We are mid-transit in the warp corridor. Jenkins said, his hands flying over his controls. The subspace friction is building. The core is drawing more power to maintain the bubble, but the increased flow is spiking the pressure in the plasma conduit. The patch, Briggs said grimly. It's failing, sir, Jenkins confirmed. The thermal load is too high. The material is breaking down. We are bleeding pressure again. If we drop out of warp now, the sudden deceleration shock will shatter the weakened glass entirely. If we stay in warp, the patch burns through and the core breaches. Time. 3 minutes, maybe less. Briggs slammed his fist onto the console. They had survived the Armada just to be killed by a physics equation. Get Wallace on the line, now. The main view screen switched to the primary core chamber. The pristine white cathedral of the engine room was filled with thin, acrid gray smoke. The alarm klaxons were blaring their dissonant, overlapping wail once again. Wallace was standing near the catwalk, looking terrified. The base of the plasma conduit was obscured by smoke, but a bright, angry orange glow was pulsing from beneath the blackened lump of duct tape. The hiss had returned louder, sharper, angrier than before. Wallace. Briggs shouted over the comms. Shut it down. Reroute the flow to the secondary lines. We can't, sir, Wallace yelled back, coughing as the smoke thickened. The secondary lines were severed in the battle. We have no bypass. We are trying to reinforce the containment field, but the plasma is eating through the patch. Briggs watched the screen. The orange glow was spreading. The tape was failing. Then a figure pushed past Wallace. It was Arthur. He was holding his battered metal toolbox in his right hand. He didn't look terrified. He looked profoundly annoyed. Move out of the way, college boy, Arthur grunted, shoving the chief engineer aside. Arthur walked up to the edge of the heat zone. The ambient temperature was already high enough to blister skin. He dropped the toolbox onto the deck plates with a heavy metallic clang. He kicked the latches open. Pendleton, Briggs shouted over the comms. Get out of there, there's nothing you can do, the tape is gone. Arthur didn't look up at the security camera. He reached into his toolbox and pulled out 2 massive heavy-duty steel hose clamps. They were thick industrial-grade bands of metal with heavy screw-drive locks. Next, he pulled out a thick rectangular square of vulcanized tire rubber. Tape was just to get us out of the firefight, Arthur muttered to himself, though the comms picked it up. Now we gotta do a hot patch. He turned to Wallace and the 2 junior technicians cowering behind him. Hey, Arthur barked, his voice cutting through the alarms like a whip. You the tall one with the data pad, get over here. The technician Miller froze. Me? Yeah, you. Move it, I need hands. Miller hesitated, looking at the glowing, hissing pipe, then scrambled forward. Put these on, Arthur ordered, shoving a pair of heavy leather rigging gloves into Miller's chest. When I tell you you are going to hold this rubber pad directly over that orange spot, it's going to be hot. Do not let go, or we both melt. You got it. Miller swallowed hard, pulling the heavy gloves onto his trembling hands. Yes. Arthur grabbed the 2 steel hose clamps and unspooled them entirely, breaking them open so they could be wrapped around the pipe rather than slipped over it. On my mark, Arthur said, holding the heavy square of tire rubber. He looked at the hissing, glowing mass of melting tape. The jet of plasma was searing hot, pushing against the dying adhesive. Mark. Arthur slammed the heavy rubber square directly over the blowout. The heat was instantaneous and brutal. Even through the thick rubber, Arthur could feel the localized heat of a dying star trying to punch through his palm. Hold it, Arthur screamed. Miller lunged forward, pressing both of his gloved hands against the back of the rubber pad, pinning it against the pipe. The leather of Miller's gloves instantly began to smoke. The young technician screamed in pain, squeezing his eyes shut, but he didn't let go. He threw his entire body weight into it. Arthur stepped back, grabbing the first steel hose clamp. His left hand, still wrapped in gauze, was clumsy and burning with fresh agony, but his right hand was steady. He threw the steel band around the back of the conduit, catching the end as it whipped around. He threaded the steel band into the screw lock. "Wrench!" Arthur yelled. Nobody moved. The technicians were paralyzed. "Give me a damn wrench!" Arthur roared. Chief Engineer Wallace, the man who held a doctorate in multidimensional field theory, scrambled to the dirt-stained toolbox. He dropped to his knees, frantically digging through the pile of primitive human tools until he found a heavy socket wrench. He sprinted forward and slammed it into Arthur's hand. Arthur didn't thank him. He jammed the socket over the locking screw on the hose clamp and started cranking. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. The sharp mechanical ratcheting sound echoed through the smoke-filled chamber. Arthur tightened the steel band directly over the top edge of the rubber pad, clamping it down with brutal force. The steel bit into the thick rubber, compressing it against the crystalline glass, squeezing the melting duct tape tight against the fracture. "Second clamp!" Arthur shouted. Wallace didn't hesitate. He picked up the second steel band from the deck and helped Arthur thread it around the bottom edge of the rubber pad. Arthur moved the wrench down. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. He pulled on the wrench with every ounce of strength left in his tired 52-year-old body. The muscles in his forearms corded tight. He tightened the bottom clamp until the steel groaned in protest, biting deeply into the rubber patch. "Miller, back off," Arthur ordered. Miller collapsed backward onto the deck, crying out as he ripped the smoking leather gloves off his blistered hands. Arthur gave the top clamp one final violent crank. The hissing stopped entirely. The orange glow beneath the thick black rubber faded, smothered by the extreme physical pressure of the steel bands. The acrid smoke in the room began to clear, pulled away by the emergency ventilation scrubbers. The deep grinding vibration that had been shaking the ship slowly smoothed out, returning to the steady, powerful hum of a stable warp transit. Arthur leaned heavily against the railing of the catwalk. His chest was heaving. Sweat poured down his face, cutting tracks through the black soot covering his cheeks. His left hand was throbbing with a sickening rhythm. He dropped the heavy socket wrench onto the deck. It landed with a loud ringing clang. He looked at the base of the multi-billion credit plasma conduit. It was now wrapped in a melted charred ball of duct tape, covered by a thick square of vulcanized tire rubber, and held together by two cheap steel hose clamps. It was the ugliest piece of engineering in the history of the Coalition fleet. Arthur reached into his pocket. He pulled out a slightly crushed tin of chewing tobacco. He packed a lip, ignoring the pain in his hand, and spat a brown stream onto the pristine white deck plating. He looked at Wallace, who was still kneeling by the toolbox, staring at the patched pipe with wide, disbelieving eyes. "That," Arthur said, his voice a gravelly whisper, "will hold until we get to the shipyard." Arthur slowly turned around and began walking toward the exit. He didn't wait for a thank you. He just wanted to find his mop. The medical bay of the Aegis was too white. It smelled of synthetic iodine, scrubbed oxygen, and the sharp metallic tang of fear sweat. It was a place designed for clean injuries, laser cauterizations, Neat incisions, the sterile realities of modern space warfare. It was not designed for a man who had practically shoved his bare hand into a fusion furnace. Arthur lay on a bio-bed, staring at the ceiling. His left arm was elevated, encased in a shimmering cylinder of regenerative gel. The pain had shifted from a screaming, blinding agony into a deep, rhythmic thud that synced perfectly with his heartbeat. The painkillers the automated surgical rig had pumped into him made his tongue feel thick and his thoughts drift like loose debris in zero gravity. He hated it. He wanted a beer. He wanted to sit in his dark, cramped quarters on Deck 80 and watch a digitized baseball game from 3 centuries ago. The doors to the ward slid open. Arthur didn't turn his head. He just listened to the footsteps. They were hesitant, a soft scuffing of rubber soles against the pristine floor, stopping then starting again. "Mr. Pendleton!" Arthur slowly rolled his head to the right. It was the kid, Miller, the engineering tech. Miller looked terrible. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with red, exhausted shadows. Both of his hands were wrapped in thick white gauze, held awkwardly at his waist. He looked like a child who had touched the stove after being told not to. "Kid," Arthur grunted, "you look like hell." Miller let out a short, breathy laugh that had no humor in it. He walked over to the side of the bed, carefully avoiding the array of monitors tracking Arthur's vitals. "They said I have second-degree burns across my palms," Miller said softly, staring at his bandaged hands. "They have me on a cellular regrowth regimen. I'll get full mobility back in a week." He looked up, his eyes locking on to the glowing cylinder encasing Arthur's arm. "They said you might lose the hand, the nerve damage, the thermal penetration. They can say whatever they want." Arthur interrupted, his voice rough but even. "It's my hand. It's staying right where it is. Might not grip a wrench as tight, but it'll hold a coffee mug." Miller swallowed hard. His lower lip trembled slightly. "I thought we were dead. When you told me to hold that rubber pad, the heat, I felt it in my teeth. I wanted to let go. I swear to God, I almost let go." "But you didn't," Arthur said. "I was terrified." "Good. Means you aren't stupid." Arthur shifted on the bed, wincing as a spike of pain shot up his shoulder. "Fear is just an engine, kid. It revs you up. What matters is where you steer the car when the pedal hits the floor. You kept your hands on the wheel. You did good." Miller looked at the floor. A single tear broke free, tracking through the dirt still caked on his cheek. He wiped it away clumsily with his wrist. "Thank you," Miller whispered. "Don't thank me. Just don't drop your damn tools on my freshly mopped floors anymore." Miller managed a weak smile, nodded once, and shuffled out of the medbay. 3 decks up, Admiral Briggs stood in the observation gallery overlooking the primary core chamber. The room was sealed off, locked down by military security. Below him, the core pulsed with a steady, brilliant sapphire light. And at the base of the plasma conduit, the grotesque blackened tumor of duct tape, tire rubber, and steel hose clamps sat in stark defiance of the universe. Chief Engineer Wallace stood beside him. Wallace hadn't slept. His uniform was wrinkled, and he was holding a data pad with a white-knuckled grip. "We've been running the telemetry for 6 hours, Admiral," Wallace said, his voice hollow. "It doesn't make sense. The steel bands are expanding and contracting with the thermal fluctuations of the crystalline matrix. They shouldn't be able to do that. The rubber should have flash melted into a liquid state. The structural integrity of the tape." Wallace Briggs said softly, not looking away from the core. "Sir, I spent 12 years at the Coalition Academy. I wrote my doctoral thesis on quantum fluid dynamics. I understand the math that holds the stars apart, and I am telling you that patch is scientifically impossible." "Is it holding?" Briggs asked. "Yes, but then the math doesn't matter." Briggs finally turned to look at his chief engineer. "You're looking at this like an academic Wallace. You're looking for perfection. The universe doesn't care about perfection. It cares about survival. Humanity didn't make it to the stars because they were the smartest species in the galaxy. They made it because they are too stubborn to die when the math says they should." Briggs looked back down at the core. "Prepare the ship for docking procedures," Briggs ordered. "We're 2 hours out from Core Station. Let the brass figure out the math." Core Station was a bureaucratic monstrosity suspended in the dark. It was a sprawling geometric nightmare of docking rings, administrative spires, and shipyard gantries that housed over 4 million coalition personnel. It was the brain of the fleet, which meant it was entirely disconnected from the reality of the hands and feet. The Aegis limped into Dry Dock 4, venting exhaust gases and trailing scorch marks across her hull. Before the docking clamps had even fully locked, the politicians arrived. They marched onto the flagship in a phalanx of pristine, unblemished uniforms. There were admirals who hadn't seen combat in 2 decades, logistics directors with data pads glued to their hands, and senior engineering inspectors wearing expressions of perpetual disdain. Leading them was Director Richmond Head of the Coalition Engineering Board. He was a tall, severe-looking man whose uniform was so heavily starched it looked like it was made of armor plating. They bypassed the bridge entirely and demanded to be taken straight to the core room. When the heavy blast doors hissed open, Richmond stopped dead in his tracks. The gaggle of inspectors piled up behind him, peering over his shoulders. The silence that fell over the Cathedral of Light was absolute. It was the silence of religious scholars discovering graffiti on their most sacred altar. "What?" Richmond whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of horror and outrage. "Is that Admiral Briggs stood by the railing, his hands clasped behind his back. That director is the reason the Aegis is sitting in your dry dock instead of floating as a cloud of radioactive ash in Sector 4. Richmond marched forward, stopping just short of the heat zone. He stared at the blackened rubber, the charred tape, and the crude, brutal steel clamps biting into the pristine machinery. "This is vandalism," Richmond snapped, turning on Briggs. "This is a desecration of coalition hardware. The thermal tolerances are completely compromised. The harmonic resonance of the crystalline lattice has been permanently altered by this garbage. The conduit was breached during a kinetic strike," Wallace said, stepping forward. He looked intimidated by the director, but he stood his ground. Containment dropped to critical levels. The patch stopped the venting. "Who authorized this modification?" Richmond demanded, his face flushing red. "I want the name of the quantum engineer who signed off on this bypass. I want to see the stress test simulations. I want to know exactly what highly classified binding agents were utilized." Briggs exchanged a look with Wallace. "There were no simulations, Director," Briggs said flatly. "And the binding agent is commercially available adhesive polymer, brought aboard by a civilian contractor." Richmond blinked. "A civilian!" The heavy blast doors hissed open again. Arthur Pendleton walked in. He moved slowly, his bad knees aching from the change in artificial gravity. He was wearing a fresh blue jumpsuit, though this one already had a grease stain near the pocket. His left hand was heavily wrapped in fresh white medical bandages. In his right hand, he carried his battered metal toolbox. He didn't look at the admirals. He didn't look at Richmond. He walked straight past the phalanx of wide-eyed, open-mouthed officers, the squeak of his rubber-soled boots echoing loudly in the vaulted chamber. He stopped next to Briggs, set the toolbox down with a heavy thud, and looked at the core. Patch held, Arthur noted his gravelly voice, cutting through the tension. Richmond stared at the aging gray-haired man. He looked at the mop bucket emblem stitched onto Arthur's shoulder. "You," Richmond said the word dripping with disbelief. "You are the one who compromised a multi-billion credit singularity drive." Arthur slowly turned his head. He looked Richmond up and down, taking in the spotless boots, the gleaming metals, and the soft, uncalloused hands. "I didn't compromise it," Arthur said. "I stopped it from blowing you and everyone else in this sector into dust. You applied unrated debris to a primary plasma feed," Richmond shouted, losing his composure. "Do you have any idea the kinetic forces at play, the dimensional shear, the sheer mathematical impossibility of what you've done?" Arthur reached into his pocket. He pulled out his tin of chewing tobacco. The collective gasp from the pristine officers was audible as Arthur packed a pinch into his lower lip. He didn't spit. Briggs had politely asked him not to on the flagship, but the disrespect was palpable. "Math is great," Arthur said slowly. "I'm sure you got a lot of fancy degrees that tell you exactly how things are supposed to work on a piece of paper. But out here where the pipe is leaking, the paper burns." "You arrogant, listen to me, shiny shoes," Arthur interrupted, his voice suddenly hard and commanding. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "That pipe is a high-pressure vessel. It cracked. I put a plug in the crack and I strapped the plug down tight so the pressure couldn't blow it out. It ain't quantum mechanics, it's plumbing." Arthur picked up his toolbox. "Now," Arthur continued looking at Briggs, "you promised me my pension, Admiral. My shift ended 4 hours ago. I'm going home." Arthur turned his back on the highest-ranking engineering officials in the galaxy and walked toward the exit. Richmond was vibrating with rage. "Admiral Briggs, arrest that man. I want him in the brig for destruction of military property." Briggs didn't move. He watched Arthur walk away. Then he turned his cold veteran eyes onto the director. "Director Richmond," Briggs said, softly, dangerously. "If you or any of your staff attempt to touch Mr. Pendleton, I will have my Marines throw you out the nearest airlock. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Richmond opened his mouth, but the look on the Admiral's face killed the words in his throat. "He saved my ship," Briggs said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "He saved my crew. You will process his retirement paperwork today with full benefits. And you will not breathe a word of this to the press, because if you do, the entire galaxy will know that your flawless, infallible engineering was saved by a human with a roll of tape." Briggs turned his back on the board and followed Arthur out the door. Hangar Bay 44 at Core Station smelled like burnt ozone stale grease and 3 million people breathing recycled air. Arthur Pendleton sat on a dented aluminum bench near the civilian transport gates, a faded canvas duffel bag resting between his scuffed boots. He wasn't wearing a uniform anymore, just a thick flannel shirt, a battered denim jacket, and a pair of jeans that had seen better days. He looked small against the backdrop of massive dreadnoughts and towering gantry cranes. Just an old man with bad knees and a stiff back waiting for a bus. His left hand was heavily wrapped in fresh, stark white bandages. The pain had subsided from a screaming fire to a dull, heavy throb kept at bay by the station's over-the-counter nerve suppressants. He flexed his fingers. They moved. Stiffly like rusty hinges lacking grease, but they moved. That was all he cared about. He had a garden back in Michigan. The tomatoes needed staking before the late summer winds picked up. You needed 2 hands for that. Across the terminal, a massive hollow screen was blaring a sanitized news report about the coalition's decisive tactical victory in Sector 4. They showed pristine footage of the Aegis firing its main batteries. They showed Admiral Briggs looking stern and heroic against a backdrop of stars. They didn't show the basement. They never did. Arthur reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his crushed tin, and packed a pinch of tobacco into his lower lip. He leaned back against the cold steel bulkhead, closing his eyes, letting the ambient drone of the station wash over him. The sharp rhythmic clicking of military-issue dress boots cut through the low murmur of the civilian terminal. Arthur didn't open his eyes until the footsteps stopped exactly 3 feet from his bench. Admiral Briggs stood there. He was alone. No adjutants, no security detail, no datapad-wielding officers flanking him. Just a career soldier standing awkwardly in the middle of a commercial transit hub, looking entirely out of his element. "Medbay informed me you refused the secondary skin grafts, Mr. Pendleton," Briggs said. His voice lacked the commanding echo of the bridge. It was just a man talking to another man. "Takes too long," Arthur replied, not bothering to stand up. He spat a brown stream into an empty paper coffee cup he held in his right hand. "I got dirt back home that needs turning before the frost hits. I can heal on the ride." Briggs nodded slowly. He looked around the dingy terminal, eyeing the exhausted cargo haulers and sleeping mechanics, waiting for their outbound flights. It was a world he had sworn to protect, but realized he knew absolutely nothing about. "Director Richmond attempted to have your pension blocked," Briggs said quietly. Arthur let out a dry, raspy chuckle. "Figures. Shiny shoes never like getting their toes stepped on." He claimed administrative irregularities regarding unauthorized modifications to military hardware. Briggs continued, his jaw tightening. "I had a closed-door meeting with Fleet Command. Your pension is approved. Full benefits retroactive to the start of the campaign. The funds have already been wired to your terrestrial account." "Appreciated, Admiral." Briggs didn't leave. He stood there, shifting his weight slightly. He reached inside his impeccably tailored tunic and pulled out a heavy rectangular object wrapped in a dark-stained piece of oilcloth. He held it out. "I know you didn't want a medal," Briggs said. "I know you don't care about the politics or the commendations. But the crew, the engineering deck, they wanted you to have something." Arthur set his coffee cup down on the floor. He took the heavy object with his good hand, feeling the surprising density of it. He rested it on his lap and carefully unfolded the oilcloth. Resting in the center of the fabric was a wrench. It wasn't a standard-issue, mass-produced coalition spanner. It was a custom-forged 10-inch ratcheting crescent wrench. The metal was matte black, incredibly heavy and cool to the touch. It was perfectly balanced, the gears in the head machined with absolute meticulous precision. Engraved deep into the handle, not laser-etched, but physically stamped into the metal with heavy strikes, were the words USS Aegis. It held. Arthur stared at it for a long time. He ran his calloused thumb over the deep, sharp grooves of the lettering. The deep-seated cynicism that usually hardened his eyes softened just for a fraction of a second. The weight of the tool in his hand felt like respect, real respect, not the kind printed on a certificate. "It's high-carbon steel," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a near whisper over the terminal noise. "Wallace had the lower machine shop mill it from the shrapnel of the dreadnought we destroyed. He said to tell you the tolerances are up to code. He tested the tensile strength himself." Arthur let out another soft laugh, gripping the handle tight. "Tell the college boy I said thanks, and tell him to stop overthinking the plumbing. Arthur reached down, popped the latches on his metal toolbox, and laid the custom wrench carefully into the top tray right next to his beat-up vice grips and spare zip ties. He snapped the latches shut. Over the terminal loudspeakers, a synthetic voice announced the final boarding call for the earthbound transport. Arthur grabbed his canvas duffel bag and slowly pushed himself up from the bench. His bad knees popped loudly in protest. Briggs snapped to attention. He didn't raise his hand in a formal salute. Arthur wasn't military, and it felt like the wrong gesture anyway, but the rigid posture was a sign of absolute, undeniable reverence. "Have a safe trip home, Mr. Pendleton." "Keep the oil changed, Admiral," Arthur said, turning toward the gate, "and watch the pressure gauges." Arthur walked up the boarding ramp, the heavy metal of his toolbox clanking against his leg. The airlock doors hissed shut, sealing him inside the transport. Briggs stood in the terminal and watched until the shuttle undocked its thrusters, flaring blue, as it merged into the endless stream of traffic, heading toward the distant muddy gravity well of Earth. Back on the Aegis, the engineering teams had finally shut down the primary core. The massive vaulted room was filled with temporary scaffolding and heavy cutting lasers as they prepared to replace the compromised plasma conduit. It took 3 teams of specialized technicians 4 hours just to cut through Arthur's patch. The raw, terrifying heat of the conduit had fused the heavy-duty duct tape, the vulcanized tire rubber, and the steel hose clamps into a solid, impenetrable mass of carbonized polymer and slag. When the ruined section of pipe finally clanged onto the deck plates, Director Richmond was waiting. He stared at the ugly, blackened lump of human refuse with pure, unfiltered disgust. "Destroy it," Richmond ordered his adjutant. "Throw it in the primary plasma incinerator. I want every trace of this humiliating aberration erased from the ship's logs. If anyone asks, the containment field held via automated secondary protocols." The adjutant logged the order. 2 junior security officers loaded the heavy chunk of glass and melted tape onto an anti-grav sled to transport it to waste processing. It never made it to the incinerator. Somewhere between Deck 40 and the waste processing facility on Deck 12, the anti-grav sled experienced a sudden and catastrophic power failure. The security cameras in the corridor coincidentally went offline for exactly 3 minutes for a routine diagnostic reboot. When the cameras came back online, the sled was empty. The security officers filed a report citing an accidental jettison through a localized airlock malfunction. Director Richmond raged for a week, threatening court-martials and launching sweeping internal investigations, but nobody talked. 3,000 mechanics, janitors, and cargo haulers suddenly developed profound amnesia. A month later, the stolen artifact quietly appeared in the enlisted men's mess hall, deep in the bowels of Core Station. It sat in a poorly constructed glass display case near the synthesizer machines, illuminated by a cheap flickering LED strip. The blackened rubber, the charred silver tape, and the brutal steel clamps sat in stark defiance of everything the Coalition stood for. There was no bronze plaque. There was no grand explanation of dimensional shear or thermodynamic thresholds. There was just a small, grease-stained piece of cardboard taped to the inside of the glass. The handwriting was messy, written in thick black marker. "If it's stupid, but it works, it ain't stupid." The brass tried to have it removed. Richmond personally sent a detail of military police to confiscate the unauthorized display. The moment the MPs stepped onto the deck, the entire maintenance staff of Core Station, over 40,000 essential personnel, simultaneously dropped their tools. They didn't riot. They didn't shout. They just sat down. The environmental scrubbers began to clog. The transit rails stalled. The artificial gravity generators flickered. The display case stayed. It became a pilgrimage site for the grease monkeys, the wrench turners, and the sanitation workers of the Galactic fleet. It was a silent monument to the unglamorous reality of survival. It was a reminder to the galaxy that perfection is an illusion. Math has limits, and when the cold, sterile universe tries to break you, there is nothing a stubborn human can't fix with a good set of vice grips, a roll of tape, and the sheer refusal to die. If you enjoyed this story of human ingenuity, grit, and the undeniable power of duct tape, please hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY content. Drop a comment below. What's the craziest thing you've ever fixed with tape? Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story from the Outer Rim. See you in the next one.